October 3rd, 1918, the Argonne Forest. 600 men move through undergrowth that hasn't known human footsteps in years. Within days, this column would become a name printed in headlines and met with disbelief. The 308th Infantry Regiment advances in a long column, equipment rattling against bodies despite every effort at silence. The forest here is dense, autumn thick, branches interlaced overhead until only fragments of grey light filter through. Everything is wet from last night's rain. Uniforms, rifles, the leaves that brush against faces in the dimness. Major Charles Whittlesey raises his hand. The column compresses behind him like an accordion. Men bunching up in the ravine. A machine gun stutters somewhere ahead. 3 seconds of that distinctive Maxim hammering. Then nothing. Testing. Waiting. Runners arrive from both flanks, gasping through the mud, bringing news that changes everything. The French on the left have stopped. The units on the right have vanished into the forest or never arrived at all. The 308th is advancing alone into German territory, though Whittlesey doesn't know this yet. He knows only that the schedule says advance, that headquarters 20 miles away expects movement, that stopping means failure. American artillery opens up in the distance, a rolling thunder that should comfort the men, but doesn't. The shells are falling somewhere else, half a mile east, maybe more. Wrong coordinates or wrong map. Both have happened before in this forest, where nothing matches the reconnaissance photos. The whistle blows, they move forward. The forest explodes around them, machine guns from 3 sides, positions invisible in the undergrowth, trees splintering at chest height. Men drop into mud before they can process what's happening. The noise drowns out thought, that overwhelming fusion of gunfire and breaking wood and human voices lost in chaos. They push forward because that's what the orders demand. Through the violence, through the spaces where men were breathing 10 seconds ago. Forward into a narrowing ravine where the forest floor drops away on both sides. By nightfall, they've advanced 500 yards and dug shallow positions on a slope beside the creek. The firing dies to sporadic bursts. In the growing quiet, German voices carry through the darkness. Movement in the underbrush. The metallic sound of weapons being positioned. The runners sent back to battalion headquarters don't return. The telephone lines, strung hastily through the trees, go silent one by one. The 308th Infantry Regiment. New York City men, immigrants and first-generation Americans, soldiers who 6 months ago were clerks and factory workers, have all walked into a trap. They're surrounded, though they won't understand the completeness of it until the morning. How did 600 American soldiers become isolated in the middle of the largest American offensive of the war? Why did they keep advancing when every indication suggested disaster? And what happened during the next 5 days in this ravine that would transform ordinary men into a legend they never asked to become? You're listening to The Crow's Tales, and this is the story of the Lost Battalion. By October 1918, the war that was supposed to end by Christmas 1914 had devoured 4 years and 10 million lives. What began with cavalry charges and gleaming bayonets had transformed into something unrecognizable, an industrial meat grinder that consumed men faster than nations could feed them in. The Lost Battalion cannot be understood without understanding this transformation. How a conflict that started with dreams of glory became a nightmare of endurance, and how that nightmare drove commanders to make decisions that would have been unthinkable 4 years earlier. The early months of the war had still resembled something from the previous century. Armies manoeuvred across open grounds, officers led from horseback, men marched in formation towards objectives they could see. But the machine gun and modern artillery ended that world in weeks. By Christmas 1914, instead of victory parades in Berlin or Paris, soldiers were digging holes in the ground that would become their homes, their fortresses, and for millions, their graves. The Western Front solidified into a line of trenches stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland. 440 miles of parallel ditches, separated by distances that could be measured in yards but might as well have been continents. Between them lay no man's land, cratered, poisoned earth where nothing grew and nothing survived. For 3 years, armies hurled themselves across this space in battles that have become synonymous with futility. The Somme, 60,000 British casualties on the first day. Verdun, 700,000 casualties for a few miles of worthless ground. Passchendaele, men drowning in mud, wounded vanishing into shell holes that became pools of liquefied earth. The war had evolved into something beyond military strategy. It was industrial mathematics. How many shells could factories produce? How many men could nations conscript? How much suffering could populations endure? Britain and France calculated that they were bleeding Germany to death through blockade and attrition. Germany calculated that unrestricted submarine warfare would starve Britain before German civilians starved. Everyone calculated wrong. By 1917, all of Europe was exhausted, armies hollowed out, economies collapsing, populations beginning to fracture. France had lost so many men that entire graduating classes from 1914 to 1917 simply didn't exist anymore. Villages throughout the country had no men between 18 and 30. The French army had mutinied in 1917. Not revolution, but a simple refusal to keep attacking. They would defend, but they would no longer walk into machine guns for generals who measured success in meters. Britain was scraping the bottom of its manpower reserves, sending boys who should have been in school and men who'd already been wounded twice. The cream of a generation lay buried in Flanders mud. Germany was dying from the inside. The British naval blockade had reduced the country to eating turnips and sawdust bread. 750,000 civilians would die from malnutrition and disease, a slow strangulation that the German High Command knew was irreversible. Russia had collapsed into revolution and civil war, giving Germany a brief respite by freeing divisions from the Eastern Front. But everyone understood this was borrowed time. Germany had perhaps one last effort before the country simply ceased to function. Into this exhausted slaughter arrived the Americans. The United States entered the war in April 1917, but entering and fighting were different things. America had an army of barely 100,000 men, suitable for chasing Pancho Villa through Mexico, but not for the Western Front. The US had 17 machine guns total. France had 17 machine guns per quarter mile of front. Building an army from almost nothing while simultaneously shipping it across an ocean under submarine threat was a logistical puzzle that took a year to solve. By September 1918, through draft and mobilization, America had over 2 million men in France, with more arriving at 300,000 per month. American military doctrine hadn't caught up to the reality of 1918 warfare. General John Pershing and his staff believed in the offensive spirit, in marksmanship and momentum, in breaking through rather than grinding down. They looked at the trench stalemate and saw European failure of will rather than the inevitable result of modern weapons. American soldiers would attack with rifles and bayonets and vigor, and surely the Germans, exhausted, starved and demoralized, would break. This confidence would cost tens of thousands of American lives in a few months, but in early 1918 it was doctrine. The German High Command understood they had one chance. Using divisions freed from the Eastern Front, they launched the Spring Offensive in March 1918. A series of massive attacks designed to split the British and French armies and win the war before the American strength became decisive. For a moment, it seemed to work. The Germans advanced 40 miles in days, something unheard of since 1914. British Field Marshal Haig issued his famous backs to the wall order, essentially telling his army they would die where they stood. They held, barely, at tremendous cost, but they held. The German offensive spent itself, like a wave breaking against rocks. They had advanced, but hadn't broken through. They had created a bulge in the line that actually made their position worse, extending their front without achieving decision. And in stopping, they had used up their last reserves, and there would be no second chance. Now it was the Allies' turn. With fresh American divisions arriving at such a rate, Marshal Ferdinand Foch ordered a series of coordinated offensives. The British would attack in the north, the French in the centre, and the Americans would launch their first major independent operation in the Meuse-Argonne sector, a heavily fortified region the Germans had held since 1914. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was ambition beyond anything the American army had attempted. 1,200,000 American soldiers would attack along a 20-mile front toward the vital railroad junction at Sedan. If Sedan fell, Germany's ability to supply its armies would collapse. The German High Command knew this. They had spent 4 years turning the Argonne Forest into a fortress. The forest itself was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. Dense woods broken by ravines and ridges, where visibility was measured in yards and units could disappear entirely. The Germans had built multiple defensive lines, concrete bunkers, pre-registered artillery zones, machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire. They knew every trail, every clearing, every fold in the ground. The Americans had French maps from 1916 that showed roads that no longer existed and didn't show German positions that had been there for years. On September the 26th, 1918, the offensive began with the bombardment that could be heard in Paris. 70 miles away, the initial advance went well. Tired German divisions fell back, and American commanders, seeing movement after years of stalemate, pushed their units forward aggressively. But by late September, the advance was slowing. The Germans had fallen back to their main defensive lines, and American inexperience was showing. Units got lost in the forest. Supplies couldn't keep up with the advance. Coordination between divisions broke down. It was into this deteriorating situation that the 77th Division was ordered forward. They called themselves the Metropolitan Division, men from New York City, over 40% foreign-born or first-generation Americans, Jews from the Lower East Side, Italians from Little Italy, Irish from Hell's Kitchen, Poles from Brooklyn. Their training had been rushed, their equipment was mixed with French and British surplus, and many barely spoke English. But they could march, and in the arithmetic of 1918, that was good enough. Their commander, Major General Robert Alexander, was under enormous pressure. The offensive was stalling. Pershing was demanding progress. French commanders were questioning American capability. Every day without advance meant more time for Germany to reinforce, more questions about whether Americans could really fight. On October the 2nd, Alexander issued orders that would send the Lost Battalion to its fate. Advance at all costs. Maintain contact with units on your flanks if possible, but above all, advance. Don't worry about exposed flanks, don't worry about supplies, take ground. Major Charles Whittlesey received these orders with the discomfort of an intelligent man being asked to do something stupid. A tall, thin Harvard law graduate who looked like a professor in uniform. Whittlesey had seen enough of war to know that advancing without flank protection in the Argonne Forest was asking for disaster. But orders were orders. The offensive must continue. The war must end. On the morning of October 3rd, Whittlesey's battalion moved into the forest. There was supposed to be one unit in a general advance, protected on both sides by parallel movements. But the French on their left had stopped, exhausted and under strength. The American unit on their right had gotten lost or been held up or simply failed to advance. In the confusion of the forest, nobody knew. Phone lines were cut by artillery. Runners sent to establish contact didn't return. But the order said advance, so Whittlesey advanced. By late afternoon, the 308th Infantry Regiment and elements of the 307th and 306th, about 600 men in total, had pushed forward 500 yards through increasing resistance and occupied positions on a slope above a small creek and a ravine. The terrain seemed defensible enough. Steep sides would funnel any German attack. The creek would provide water. They could hold here until the flanking units caught up. As darkness fell on October the 3rd, Whittlesey's men dug shallow foxholes along the slopes. Standard procedure said to send runners back before full dark, confirming positions and maintaining contact. The first runner left at 1800 hours, the second at 1830. Neither returned. But this wasn't unusual in the Argonne, where men got lost even in daylight. The field telephone still worked, crackling with static, but functional. Division headquarters acknowledged their position. Promised supplies would move up in the morning. The French would resume their advance at dawn. The units on the right were just delayed, not missing. Everything would align tomorrow. But Whittlesey couldn't shake his unease. The forest was too quiet. Not the exhausted quiet after a day's fighting, but something else, a held breath, a waiting. German voices carried down from the ridges above, not retreating but repositioning. The clink of metal on stone, the sound of digging. His sentries reported movement on all sides, shapes in the darkness, but no attacks came. Private Abraham Krotashinsky, posted on the perimeter, heard them first. Germans behind them, where the battalion had advanced from. Not stragglers, but organised units, setting up machine guns, stringing wire. The trap wasn't closing, it had already closed. Whittlesey tried to sleep, knowing tomorrow would bring in the relief or something worse. Around him, 600 men settled into positions they thought were temporary, not knowing they would hold this ground for 5 days that would reshape their understanding of endurance, of duty, of what men could survive when survival seemed impossible. The Metropolitan Division's most vulnerable soldiers, immigrants and city boys who'd never seen a forest before training, were about to become the most famous American unit of the war, though fame was the last thing any of them would have wanted in the long nights ahead. The trap revealed itself slowly, then all at once. On the morning of October the 4th, Major Charles Whittlesey sent his first runners back to battalion headquarters as routine, reporting position, requesting supplies, maintaining contact. Standard procedure for any unit that had advanced 500 yards into enemy territory on the previous day. His 600 men held decent defensive positions in a ravine, arranged in an oval perimeter 300 yards long and 60 yards deep. The Germans had pulled back during their advance. Perhaps they were retreating along the entire front. The first runner didn't return, neither did the second, and by noon, when the fourth messenger failed to appear, Whittlesey knew something was fundamentally wrong. The field telephone lines went dead, not cut, but producing German voices when his signal operator cranked the handle. Patrols sent to investigate the flanks reported Germans where American units should have been, not stragglers or rear guards, but organised positions with interlocking machine gun fields. The geography told the rest of the story. The ravine that seemed like good defensive terrain was actually a natural amphitheatre. Germans held the high ground on 3 sides. Perfect observation, every inch of the American position visible from above. The fourth side, the route they'd advanced through, was now blocked by German forces that had flowed around them during the night like water filling a depression. They had advanced into a pocket while adjacent units stalled or fell back. They weren't just cut off, they were completely surrounded by an enemy who knew exactly where they were, how many there were, and how little chance they had of escape. The German response was methodical. First came the snipers, infiltrating during darkness to positions where they could cover the entire pocket. Any movement drew fire. Officers were specifically targeted. The Germans had identified command posts through binoculars and made them death zones. The battalion's medical officer took a bullet through the throat while treating wounded on the first morning, bleeding out in minutes while men pressed uselessly on the wound. Then came the mortars and Minenwerfers, weapons designed to drop shells at near vertical angles into trenches and foxholes. The Americans could hear them firing, that distinctive hollow thump, then count the seconds until impact. There was no defense against shells that fell directly from above. Each explosion carved out a crater, burying men who had to be dug out before they suffocated, only to be buried again by the next barrage. By October the 5th, the second day of full encirclement, the essentials were already failing. Water meant crawling 30 yards to the creek under direct machine gun fire. The Germans had the approaches calculated, bursts of fire sweeping the ground every few minutes, bodies floating in the water by morning. Food was gone except for emergency rations men tried to divide into thumbnail portions. Medical supplies exhausted. The wounded multiplied faster than they could be treated, collected in a hollow that provided no real protection. Men shot in the morning were shot again where they lay in the afternoon. The Germans attacked the perimeter constantly but carefully, probing for weakness rather than attempting to overrun. Stormtroopers with grenades and flamethrowers would assault one section while machine guns pinned down reinforcements from the other part of the line. Each attack cost the Americans ammunition they couldn't replace. Some positions were held by men with 3 bullets left. Others only had bayonets and stones. Then, on October the 6th, came the cruelest blow of all. The first shell sounds different. A whistle cracked through the air that every American soldier recognizes. French 75mm guns, the backbone of Allied artillery, firing from positions miles behind the lines. After 2 days of German mortars dropping at random, the sound brings men crawling from their holes. Finally, their own artillery has found them. The shell detonates 200 yards south, behind German lines. Perfect. Men actually cheer. Hoarse croaks from throats dry as paper, but celebration nonetheless. The second shell lands closer, 150 yards. The third, 100. The barrage is walking forward, systematic and precise, exactly how the American artillery schools teach it. Textbook perfect. Too perfect. The fourth shell lands 50 yards away. Earth fountains into the sky. The fifth is inside the perimeter. A direct hit on the southern edge where Company K holds the line. Bodies and equipment fly apart. Men who were cheering 10 seconds ago scramble for cover that doesn't exist. These aren't random German mortars. These are American guns firing with mathematical precision. And the mathematics say the next shell will land directly on top of them. The barrage intensifies, a curtain of steel walking through the pocket in measured steps. Shell after shell, every 6 seconds, bracketing their position. The Americans know this pattern. They've watched it clear German trenches, seen it turn fortified positions into moonscape. Now they're underneath it. Their own guns, the best artillery in the war, are systematically destroying them. A soldier runs towards Whittlesey's command post and simply disappears. A direct hit that leaves only red mist and a crater. Others huddle in holes that offer no protection from shells falling at steep angles. The noise is beyond sound, a physical force that crushes thought. Between explosions, men scream at the sky, at their own guns, at God. Stop, we're Americans, stop. But 5 miles away, American artillerymen feed shells into breaches with practiced efficiency, following fire plans drawn up at headquarters, supporting what they believe is an American advance. Whittlesey pulls out his message pad, hands shaking with fury more than fear. Everything they've survived means nothing if they die under friendly fire. 3 carrier pigeons remain in their basket, covered by a corporal's body to protect them from fragments. The first bird, released with a desperate message, makes it 20 feet before shrapnel tears it apart. The second pigeon won't fly. Shell-shocked, it circles the command post and lands back in the ruins. Men curse it, throw dirt at it, trying to force it into the air. The barrage is reaching its crescendo. Shells landing so fast they overlap. The ground jumping continuously. In 20 minutes, they've taken more casualties from American artillery than from 2 days of German attacks. Cher Ami is the last bird, already wounded, one leg nearly severed by a German bullet that morning. As Whittlesey clips the aluminium message tube to its remaining good leg, another shell lands close enough to shower them with dirt and human remains. The bird struggles from his hand, wings beating frantically. German rifles crack from the ridges. They know exactly what the Americans are trying to do. Machine guns sweep the air where the pigeon climbs. Americans watch in horror as red feathers explode from Cher Ami's breast. The bird tumbles, recovers, and continues climbing. One wing hangs wrong. Blood streams from its chest. Its right leg dangles by a tendon, but it flies. A broken, impossible flight over the trees, over the German lines, carrying 22 words that represent the battalion's only hope. We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop. The shells keep falling. 1 minute, 2, 5. Men count each impact, wondering if the bird made it, if anyone received the message, if they'll die here under their own guns. 10 minutes, 15. The barrage should run 30 minutes, standard procedure, and they're 28 minutes in when suddenly, abruptly, the shells stop falling. The silence is deafening, ears ringing from pressure changes. Men crawl from holes that have become graves, counting who's left, who's wounded, and who's simply gone. The neat perimeter they've held for 3 days is a cratered moonscape. Bodies of men killed by Germans lie next to bodies of men killed by Americans, and in death, there's no difference. The friendly fire broke something fundamental in the battalion's survivors. Not their will to fight, that would come later, but their understanding of their place in the war. They were coordinates on a map, objectives in orders written by men who had never seen this forest. Their survival depended on a pigeon with one leg flying through machine gun fire. That night, October the 6th into October the 7th, was the worst yet. The wounded from the barrage added to those already suffering. Men with stomach wounds begged for water that couldn't be given. It would kill them faster. Others, heads wrapped in torn shirts to cover eyes blown out by shell fragments, called for mothers thousands of miles away. The living lay among the dead because there was nowhere else to go, no way to bury anyone under constant German observation. The Germans knew the Americans were weakening. On the morning of October the 7th, they tried psychological warfare. An officer with an American accent in English called down from the ridge, describing exact positions, naming wounded men visible through binoculars, explaining how the war was ending anyway, how dying here meant nothing. When words failed, they sent something more formal. A lone American soldier appeared at the perimeter under a white flag. Private Lowell Hollingshead, captured in an earlier patrol, now carrying a message from the German commander. Whittlesey read the typewritten note to his officers. It was almost polite, appealing to humane sentiments, noting that the suffering of wounded Americans could be heard in German lines, offering honourable surrender. The debate was brief but intense. Some officers argued for accepting. Ammunition nearly gone, wounded dying without care, no sign of relief. Others wanted to fight on, arguing the Germans wouldn't offer terms unless they were too desperate. Whittlesey listened to both sides, then made his decision without drama. He read the note aloud once more, tore it up, and told Hollingshead to return to the German lines. No white flag would be shown from American positions. The Germans got their answer when rifles opened up on the next probe. By dawn on October the 8th, something had changed. The German fire was sporadic, uncoordinated. Machine guns that had fired for 5 days went silent. Through the morning, the sounds of battle shifted, distant now, moving north. German mortars started up beyond the ridges. The pressure was lifting. American patrols from the 307th Infantry pushed through the abandoned German positions that afternoon. finding the pocket by following the smell. Of 554 men who entered the ravine 5 days earlier, 194 walked out on their own. 119 were carried on stretchers. The rest lay scattered through the ravine, killed by Germans, killed by Americans, killed by the arithmetic of industrial war. The relieving soldiers stopped at the perimeter's edge, stunned by what they found. The survivors looked barely human, hollow-eyed, skeletal, some unable to speak from thirst, others unable to stop talking from shock. They had held because they were ordered to hold, survived by accidents they'd spend lifetimes trying to understand, and entered history through a newspaper nickname they never chose, the Lost Battalion. The survivors of the Lost Battalion emerged from the Argonne Forest into a world that had already begun mythologizing them. While they'd been counting bullets and drinking mud, American newspapers had discovered their story. Lost Battalion, still holding out, ran across front pages from New York to San Francisco. Americans, hungry for heroic narratives from a war that had already cost 50,000 of their sons, seized on these 600 men who'd refused to surrender. But the mathematics told a different story. Of the 554 men who entered the pocket, 241 were dead or missing, a casualty rate of 43% in 5 days. Some companies ceased to exist. Machine gun crews were found at their positions with no ammunition, having fought until overrun. Bodies lay in patterns that showed the final moments. Men crawling toward the creek for water, runners caught between the lines, soldiers who tried to dig deeper as shells walked through their positions. The relief force discovered horrors that would never make the newspapers. Men so thirsty they'd drunk their own urine mixed with mud. Wounded soldiers with maggots already in their wounds, which paradoxically had saved them from gangrene. The larvae eating the dead tissue before infection spread. Living men who couldn't be distinguished from corpses until they blinked. One soldier found propped up against a tree had been dead for 2 days, but no one had noticed, because the dead and the living looked identical by the end. The Pentagon's after-action report was clinical. Unit advanced beyond supporting elements and was isolated due to failure of flanking units to maintain alignment. What this meant in human terms was that 600 men had walked into hell because generals working from outdated maps demanded aggressive action, because communication systems built for static trenches couldn't function in fluid combat, because the American military doctrine of perpetual attack met the reality of German defensive expertise in terrain they had held for 4 years. The heroes came home to a nation that needed them to be symbols. Private Krotashinsky received the Distinguished Service Cross. Cher Ami, the one-legged pigeon who'd saved them from friendly fire, was stuffed and displayed in the Smithsonian, where schoolchildren could marvel at the bird that flew through machine gun fire with a message tube dangled from its severed leg. The story became cleaner, with each telling, American determination defeating German aggression, never mentioning that American artillery had nearly finished what the Germans started. For Major Charles Whittlesey, promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and awarded the Medal of Honor, the attention was unbearable. He was paraded at Liberty Bond rallies, asked to give speeches about heroism and sacrifice. Reporters wanted to know how it felt to be a hero. Society matrons wanted him at their dinners. Everyone wanted the story of the Lost Battalion, but they wanted it sanitized, courage without horror, victory without cost. Whittlesey knew what they didn't, that survival had been largely accidental. A pigeon flying left instead of right, German artillery shells that failed to explode, rain on October the 5th that provided just enough moisture to keep the men alive. The German withdrawal prompted by pressure elsewhere, not by anything the Lost Battalion had done. They had held their positions, yes, but positions held by dead men are still positions held. The line between hero and corpse was often just timing. He returned to law practice but couldn't concentrate. In court, arguing contracts and torts, he would suddenly be back in the pocket, counting ammunition, watching men die for yards of worthless forest. He corresponded with survivors, checking on the wounded, helping with disability claims, attending too many funerals of men who'd survived the war but not the peace. The Spanish flu took some, Suicide took others. Men who'd endured 5 days in hell couldn't endure 5 years of remembering it. On November the 26th, 1921, 3 years after the armistice, Whittlesey boarded the SS Taloa, bound for Havana. Somewhere in the night between November the 26th and 27th, he jumped into the Atlantic. His body was never found. In his cabin, investigators found letters he'd been writing to fellow survivors, checking on their health, asking after their families. He'd been carrying the Lost Battalion with him every day since the Argonne, and finally, the weight had pulled him under. The Lost Battalion revealed truths about modern warfare that military theorists would spend decades digesting. That technology had outpaced tactics. That communication systems designed for predictable battlefields collapsed in fluid situations. That individual courage meant nothing against industrial firepower. That the space between victory and catastrophe was measured in single decisions, single messages, single flights of birds through bullets. More fundamentally, it exposed the gap between those who planned operations and those who executed them. Staff officers working from maps that showed neat lines and clear objectives, issuing orders to maintain aggressive spirit and advance at all costs, had no concept of what those orders meant in the Argonne Forest, where visibility was 30 yards and Germans held every piece of high ground. The Lost Battalion held because the alternative to holding was death, not because holding served any strategic purpose. They were saved not by their own actions, but by German decisions made for reasons that had nothing to do with the pocket. Yet the story endures, not as propaganda intended, but as something more complex. It's remembered because it captures the fundamental absurdity of soldiers' experience in modern war. Following orders that make no sense, surviving by accidents beyond control, becoming heroes for simply not dying when dying would have been easier. The Lost Battalion didn't charge into glory. They walked into a mistake and refused to surrender to it. Today, in the Argonne Forest, nature has reclaimed the ravine. Trees grow where men died. Rain still collects in the creeks where soldiers crawled for water under machine gun fire. Occasionally, hunters find remnants, shell casings, uniform buttons, bones that could be German or American. The forest keeps its secrets, having long ago absorbed the blood and returned to what it was before October 1918. A quiet place where birds sing and leaves fall, and nothing suggests that once, for 5 days, this was the entire world for 600 men who didn't know if the next minute would bring relief or death. The Lost Battalion's real memorial isn't in museums or monuments, but in the questions it leaves. What do we owe those who follow orders into disaster? How do we measure heroism when survival is accidental? Why do we need to believe that suffering has meaning? Perhaps Whittlesey, standing at the rail of the Taloa that November night, knew the answer. Perhaps that's why he jumped. Well then, there you have it. If you've listened this far and like what you've heard, consider liking and subscribing. Also hit that notification bell to be notified of future stories. I release a new one every Sunday. As a new channel, it helps so much, not only in pushing these stories in front of more of you lovely people, but also reassures me I'm not just sending these off into the ether, never to be seen again. If you've listened this far and don't like what you've heard, then, what on earth are you doing? Right then, off you pop. Thanks for listening.